Rain. Grant Sullivan had driven 30 yards past the abandoned bus shelter before he hit the brakes. An old woman sat under the overhang in a cashmere coat. The rain had ruined one shoe gone. She did not look relieved when his headlights found her. She stepped back half a step. He opened the door anyway, drove her home, and left. 15 minutes of his life, he told himself. 11 hours later, a knock rattled the hinges of his apartment door. Through the peephole, Grant saw a tailored suit worth more than the life insurance his wife had left behind. Not police. What he could not have known was that the moment he turned the latch, the man who scraped by on night shifts would never find his way back to his old life again. The garage went dark, one bank of lights at a time, and Grant Sullivan wiped the last of the grease from his hands in the shadows. 1 in the morning. His phone buzzed against the workbench, a message from Mrs. Delaney down the hall, the widow who sat with Nora on the nights he closed the shop. She waited up till 11 again. Fell asleep on the couch, so I moved her to bed. He read it twice. 9 years old, and she still would not shut her eyes until she heard his key in the door. Still counting under her breath when the thunder rolled, still sleeping with the lamp burning, because somewhere she had learned that the dark was a thing that took people out of a house and did not bring them back. He knew exactly where she had learned it. Grant slid the phone into his pocket next to a wallet that had long ago stopped closing all the way. It was too full of things he should have thrown out: a photograph worn soft at the corners, a hospital bill he had never paid and never would kept for a reason he had given up trying to name. A little over a year now, long enough that the men at the shop had stopped dropping their voices when he walked past. Not long enough that he had made peace with the 40 minutes. He had been flat on his back beneath a lifted sedan when the hospital called. Claire had taken a turn, the voice said. He should come. And he had told himself he was coming, but there were 30 minutes left on a job already promised, a customer already sour, rent already past due, and some stubborn animal part of him had decided that finishing the work was the responsible thing, the grown-up thing, the thing she would have wanted. So he wiped his hands. He clocked out clean. He drove the speed limit the whole way. He reached her room 40 minutes after she was gone. No one blamed him. That was the part he could not get past. There was no one to argue with, no failure anyone else could point to, only the one he folded up small and carried like the bill in his wallet. Proof of a night he had chosen the reasonable thing and learned what it was worth. These days he took every late shift the shop would give him. The nights were quieter, the pay a hair better, and there was the small mercy of coming home after Nora was already down, so she never had to watch him arrive worn to nothing. It was not a life he would have chosen. It was the one that kept the lights on and the debt from swallowing them whole, and most days that was enough to ask of it. The way home took him through the industrial flats on the east side, a long run of shuttered warehouses and chain link where the street lights failed every third pole. The rain came down harder than the wipers could clear. It was a road a man drove fast and did not stop on, and Grant was doing exactly that when his headlights swept across something under the roof of a bus shelter no bus had served in years. A person. Not standing at the curb the way someone waiting for a ride would stand, but folded onto the bench with both arms wrapped around herself. He was past her before his mind finished assembling the picture. An old woman. Silver hair plastered to her skull, a coat that had cost more than his truck soaked black to the shoulders, 1 foot bare against the concrete. It was the clothes that made it worse. Not better a woman dressed like that did not wind up on a bench in the industrial flats at 1 in the morning by any road that made sense. She had turned toward his headlights, and this was the detail that would not leave him afterward. She did not raise a hand. She did not rise. She shrank back against the wall, pressing herself smaller the way a person pulls away from a threat and not toward help. No one who wanted saving looked at it like that. Grant kept driving. 30 yards, maybe 40. The sensible arithmetic ran itself the way it always did a stranger on a bad road at 1 in the morning, a daughter asleep across the city. A dozen good reasons a man with someone depending on him did not stop. He had a rule about exactly this. Every driver in this city had the same rule. Then his foot was on the brake, and the truck was sliding to a stop in the wet. And he could not have told a soul why, except that he had done the sensible thing once before in his life. He had finished the job. He had driven the speed limit. He knew now what the sensible thing cost, and he found he could not sit behind the wheel and drive on one more time. He put the truck in reverse. Leaning across the seat, he shoved the passenger door open. Rain gusted in. "Ma'am, you can't stay out here. Get in." She studied the open door, then studied him taking his measure. Up close, her face was fine-boned and used to being obeyed, and it sat strangely on the wreck of the rest of her. "I'm not going to hurt you," Grant said. "I've got a little girl at home. I only want to get you somewhere dry." Something in that reached her. She climbed in with a slow care that was half dignity and half exhaustion, and pulled the door shut against the storm. She took in the cab in a single sweep, the cracked vinyl seats, the work light clipped to the visor, the smell of motor oil that no amount of air freshener would ever beat out of it. And something in her seemed to settle a fraction, as though a man who smelled of honest work was a safer bet than whatever she had been weighing under that shelter. He already had his phone in his hand. "I'm calling the police. They can get you." "No!" It came fast and flat, and her hand closed on his forearm with more strength than he had braced for. "No police. You're hurt. You're soaked through. I know precisely what I am." She released his arm, and when she spoke again, it was lower-edged with a bitterness that was plainly not meant for him. "You call them, and the first question out of their mouths will be what year it is." He had no idea what to do with that. He set the phone down on the console. "Is there someone I can call then, family?" "My daughter." She said it firmly, and then the firmness began to thin at the edges. Her mouth shaped the start of a number that would not arrive. "I have it written down. It's in my bag." Her eyes dropped to a lap that held no bag at all. "My bag is in the car." "What car?" She did not answer that. Instead, she gave him an address, a street up in the North Hills, the kind with gates and long walls and money that had been money for generations, and she gave it cleanly without a stumble, the way a person recites the one thing no one has managed to take from them yet. 40 years in the same house. That much was still hers. They drove. The downpour eased to a drizzle. Twice she asked how much farther it was, and twice he told her. And a mile past the second time, she began to ask a third in the very same words, and then stopped herself halfway through. Her jaw set. She turned her face to the black glass of the window, and Grant understood that she had caught the sound of her own voice, that she knew that whatever was quietly coming loose inside her, she was still present enough to feel it slip. He did not fill the quiet with reassurances she had not asked for. Whatever this woman was losing, he sensed she would rather lose it without an audience narrating the fall, and so he only drove and watched the wet road and let her keep what was left of her composure. When the estates began to rise behind their walls, she straightened in the seat. "Not the gate. Let me out here." "It's still coming down. I can pull right up to Bob. Here." The word allowed nothing. She was staring down the long, private drive toward a set of iron gates, and there was something in her face he could not name. Not fear of him, but fear of something waiting at the end of that road. "I don't know who's on the gate tonight," she said half to herself. He stopped where she told him 2 blocks shy of the entrance, beneath one of the few streetlights that still burned. She worked the door open, then held there, and her gaze snagged on the photograph taped to his dash. Nora at 7, gap-toothed, squinting up into the light of a summer he could still feel on his arms. "Yours. My daughter." The old woman held her eyes on the picture a beat longer than the question called for. When she spoke again, the commanding edge had drained out of her voice, and what remained sounded very close to a warning. "Get home fast." She set one bare foot down onto the wet pavement, And don't tell anyone you saw me tonight." Then she was gone from the truck, the door thudding shut behind her, and Grant sat watching her walk away down that dark road toward the gates. A small, straight figure in a ruined coat, the missing shoe now hanging from one hand until the rain drew closed over her and she was lost to it. 15 minutes of his life, he told himself. He was wrong about that too. By the time the knock came, Grant had managed a little more than 3 hours of sleep. He had gotten Nora off to school on no rest at all, moving through the gray morning like a man walking the floor of a river. And it was only after her bus pulled away that he'd let himself fall into bed with his boots still on. The old woman had followed him down into whatever passed for sleep. He kept seeing the way she'd shrunk from his headlights, the bare foot on the wet meant the number her mouth had shaped and failed to find. By noon, he had half convinced himself he'd dreamed the whole thing. Then the knock came, and it was not the knock of a neighbor. It was 3 flat strikes that carried the weight of a fist used to close doors opening on command, and it rattled the loose hinges he kept meaning to fix. He crossed the small apartment and put his eye to the peephole. On the landing stood a woman in a charcoal suit that had been cut to her by someone who was paid very well to do it, and behind her, 1 step down and half a body wider, a man in his 50s with a soldier's stillness and eyes that had already counted every exit on the floor. Not police. Police did not dress like the woman, and they did not stand like they held the deed to the building. Grant worked the chain and opened the door as far as it would go. The woman looked at him the way a person reads a contract before signing it. She did not offer a hand. She did not offer a name. "Why did you stop?" It was not the question he'd braced for. "I'm sorry." Last night, on Kessler Road past the old transit stops, a woman was sitting under a shelter and you drove past her, and then you turned around and went back. Her voice was low and even and entirely certain. "I want to know why." Behind him, the apartment was a wreck of single-father life. Nora's drawings taped crooked to the cabinets, a cereal bowl in the sink, the couch still dented where Mrs. Delaney had moved her off it. He was suddenly aware of all of it, and just as suddenly aware that he did not care what this woman made of it. "Because she needed help," he said. "Who are you?" "My name is Camille Ashford. The woman you drove home is my mother. Her name is Eleanor." She let that settle, and when he didn't fill the space with anything, she went on. "She was gone for most of last night. We had people looking, and then she was standing inside our gate close to 2 in the morning, soaked to the skin, and she told us a mechanic had brought her. It took my office until this morning to find out which one." The man behind her had not moved, but Grant felt the weight of his attention shift the way you feel a dog decide you're not a threat. "This is Dean," Camille said without turning. "He runs my security. He would like to have a conversation with you at some point about the route you took and everything you saw. But first," she reached into the inside of her jacket and withdrew a folded check, and she held it out across the threshold between them as naturally as another person might hand over a business card. "I want to thank you." Properly. Grant looked at the check. He did not have to see the number to know it was the kind that changed a month, maybe a year. He thought about the hospital bill folded in his wallet, and the shop lease he'd never afford, and Nora's school with its cracked windows and its metal detector at the door. For one long breath, the whole architecture of his life leaned toward that slip of paper. "No," he said. "Thank you, but no." Something moved across Camille Ashford's face that he would only understand much later. It was not offense. It was confusion. Genuine, disoriented, the look of a woman who has handed over the correct payment and been told the transaction cannot proceed and does not know what the machine wants from her instead. "I don't think you understand the situation," she said. "There's no obligation. My mother is safe because of you. This is simply what that's worth to me. I didn't do it because it was worth anything." He heard how it sounded and didn't soften it. "I've got a daughter asleep down the hall most nights I come home. If she was ever out somewhere in the rain, I'd want somebody to stop. That's all it was. You don't pay a person for that. It stops meaning what it means. The man called Dean studied him now with something that was almost interest. Camille returned the check to her jacket with a slowness that suggested she was recalibrating, revising some private estimate of what he wanted, and coming up empty. "You know my name," Grant said. "You know where I live. You had it by this morning. How?" "I pay people to find things out. It's not complicated." She said it without arrogance, as a plain description of how her world functioned. "Then somebody else can pay them too." That reached her in a way the refused money had not. For an instant, the certainty in her face thinned, and behind it, he saw a woman who had been afraid for longer than she'd let anyone watch. She recovered fast. From the same jacket, she produced a card heavy stock and turned it over, and on the blank back, she wrote a number in a quick hard hand before holding it out. "That's my private line," she said. "Not an office, not an assistant. Me." He took it because refusing it seemed like a fight not worth having. "You did a decent thing for my family, Mr. Sullivan. And decent is rarer than you'd think from where I stand. If anything about last night ever troubles you, anything you remember, anything anyone asks you, that number reaches me directly. Any hour." He didn't know then why she thought anyone would ask him anything. He tucked the card into the wallet that wouldn't close behind the photograph and the bill, and told himself he'd never use it. They left. He watched the black car ease down the block from his window, too clean and too quiet for the street, and he went back to bed and did not sleep at all. He went into the shop that evening because sleep was finished with him, and because a man who took every late shift did not turn one down. He'd been under a delivery van for the better part of an hour when a voice came from somewhere near his boots, pleasant and unhurried. "They keep you late here, or do you keep yourself?" Grant rolled out on the creeper. A man stood over him, ordinary in the way that took effort, mid-40s, a windbreaker, a haircut you'd forget before you reached the door. He was smiling. It was a good smile, the kind that had opened a lot of doors before its owner said whatever he'd come to say. "We're closed to walk-ins," Grant said, wiping his hands. "Something I can do for you?" "Hope so." The man produced a laminated card from his windbreaker and let Grant see it without quite letting him read it. "I'm doing some follow-up for an insurance matter. Missing person adjacent, nothing dramatic. Older woman went wandering last night out on the east side. We're just trying to piece together her movements before somebody's lawyer makes it complicated." The smile held. "Word is, you gave a lady a lift out that way. That'd be a real help to me, the timeline." Every instinct Grant owned went quiet and cold at once, the way the shop went quiet when a lift wasn't seated right. No insurance man worked a missing person timeline at 8 in the evening on the day it happened. No insurance man found his way to the one mechanic who'd stopped. "You've got the wrong shop," Grant said. "Maybe." The man didn't argue it. His eyes moved unbothered across the workbench, the pegboard, the open toolbox at Grant's hip. "Mind if I—" He reached down and lifted a wrench off the bench, turned it over in his hand, as though weighing the honest heft of it, and set it back down, not quite where it had been. "Good tools. You take care of your things." He straightened, and the smile came back around like the second hand of a clock. "I'll get out of your hair. Appreciate the time." He was 3 steps toward the bay door when he half-turned, easy an afterthought. "Say hi to Nora for me." Then he was gone into the dark of the lot, and Grant stood there with a wrench that had been moved 2 inches and his daughter's name hanging in the air of his own shop, spoken by a man who had no earthly business knowing it. His hands were steady. That was the strange thing. His hands were perfectly steady, and everything behind his ribs had turned to water. For a day and a half he tried to make it be nothing. He told himself the man was exactly what he'd claimed, that names could be found the same way Camille Ashford found addresses, that a city was full of ordinary menace that meant a person no specific harm. He did not throw the wrench away, though he wanted to. He did check the locks twice that night, and he did stand in Nora's doorway longer than usual, watching the little lamp throw its steady circle over her sleeping face, over the drawings stacked on her nightstand. And he did not let himself finish the thought that was trying to form. Then, Nora came home from school on the second afternoon and told him about the car. She told it the way she told everything sideways and quiet drawing at the kitchen table while she talked, so that he almost missed it. There was a gray car, she said, that had gone slow beside her the whole way from the bus stop, slow as walking, and when she stopped to fix her shoe, it stopped too, and when she went on, it went on. And it had a man in it who wasn't looking at his phone like the parents did. She said it without much alarm, because she was 9, and the world had not yet taught her which of its shapes to fear. She said it and kept coloring, and Grant sat down across from her very carefully so that his face would not do what it wanted to do. What color was the man's jacket, sweetheart? She thought about it. Blue, like a raincoat, but not. A windbreaker. He made her a snack with hands that had gone back to being steady, because that was a thing his hands did, in a crisis that the rest of him could not, and he waited until she was settled in front of the television with the volume up, and then he went out to the truck and sat in it, and did not start it. He found the gray car 2 blocks over, parked with a view of his building's entrance, and he did the thing a smarter man would not have done. He walked straight up to it and rapped on the driver's glass. The window came down. It was the same man, the same forgettable haircut, the same easy warmth sitting there in the fading light with a coffee in the cup holder, like a man on his lunch. Mr. Sullivan. He sounded pleased, as though Grant had done something considerate. I was hoping we'd talk again. Stay away from my kid. Grant's voice came out low and flat, and not entirely his own. Whatever this is, you do not go near her again. I haven't gone near anybody. The man lifted both hands off the wheel, a gesture of reason. I drove down a public street. Nobody touched a hair on that little girl's head. And nobody's going to. I want to be real clear about that, because I think you've got the wrong idea about me. He turned in his seat unhurried, and now the warmth had a shape under it Grant could feel. Here's the whole thing, and then I'm gone. You drove a woman home the other night. For a few minutes she talked, or she didn't, and either way, you heard how she sounded. That's all anybody needs from you. Not testimony, not a statement, nothing with your name on it. Just between us, one working man to another, whether the old girl was all there. And there's real money in the answer, life-changing money for a guy in your spot. You could stop taking the late ones. I don't have anything to sell you. Everybody's got something to sell. The man smiled, and it was almost gentle. Think about the girls' school. Think about that hospital paper you're carrying around. He watched Grant's face change and gave a small nod, as if a suspicion had been confirmed. Yeah, we know the shape of your life, Grant. That's not a threat. That's me telling you I understand it. Sleep on it. The window went up. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb and was gone, and Grant stood in the street with the knowledge now that there was nothing ordinary about any of it, and that whatever the old woman had walked out of 2 nights ago, he and his daughter were standing in the doorway of it now. He went back upstairs. He took the heavy card out of his wallet, the private number in that hard, fast hand, and he stood over the kitchen trash and dropped it in on top of the coffee grounds and the crusts of Nora's sandwich, because calling Camille Ashford meant this was real, and he did not want it to be real. At midnight, with Nora asleep and the lamp burning and the locks checked 3 times, he took the trash bag out, and he stood in the cold stairwell under the buzzing light, and he dug through it until he found the card, and he called the number. She answered on the second ring, wide awake, as though she had been sitting up waiting for exactly this. "There's a man following my daughter," Grant said. "He knows her name. He offered me money to tell him what your mother said in my truck." He heard his own breath in the stairwell. "I don't know what I stepped in, but I've got a 9-year-old and I need help, and you're the only number I've got." There was no surprise on the other end. That was the thing that frightened him most. "Where are you?" Camille said. It was not a question. "Don't pack. Dean will be there in 20 minutes. Bring your daughter and whatever she can't sleep without." The Ashford house sat behind its walls at the top of the North Hills, like something that had been poured rather than built, all pale stone and glass that gave back the sky. There were more rooms than Grant could account for, and a quiet in them that was not peace, but its expensive imitation. Dean walked them in past two men Grant hadn't seen at the apartment, and a housekeeper made up a room for Nora with a bed she could have gotten lost in. And Camille stood in the enormous front hall in the middle of the night and told Grant, without ceremony, most of what he did not want to know. Nora would not settle. She sat in the vast, strange bed with her knees pulled up and would not lie down, and when Grant sat on the edge of it, she looked at him with an accusation too big for her small face. "I want my own room," she said. "I want my own light. Why do we have to be here?" He had no answer that a 9-year-old could hold. He could not tell her that a man in a blue windbreaker had said her name in his shop. He could only sit with her and rub slow circles on her back, the way Claire used to, and tell her the lie all parents tell, that it was just for a little while, that they were safe, that he was right there. She fell asleep at last with her hand fisted in his sleeve, and he sat in the dark of a millionaire's guest room and understood that in bringing her here to keep her safe, he had also broken the one promise he'd managed to keep since her mother died, that her small life would stay steady, that her light would stay on, that she would always wake up where she'd gone to sleep. He had traded her sense of home for her body's safety, and he did not know how to feel like anything but a man who kept choosing the reasonable thing and paying for it in the wrong currency. The truth came out over the next 2 days in pieces in the long, bright rooms of that house, and it was worse and stranger than the shape he'd imagined. He learned it partly from Camille and partly more sharply from Eleanor herself, who moved through the mansion with the wary dignity of a guest in a place she had every right to own. She knew him the moment she saw him. "The mechanic," she said, and there was something in her face that was almost relief, as if his being real confirmed that the night had been real too. Eleanor had not wandered. 3 weeks before the rain, a car had come for her own family's car, driven by a man she had trusted for years, and she had been taken to what she'd been told was a doctor's appointment, and there she'd been asked questions by strangers, made to perform small, humiliating tasks, and pressed to put her name to papers she was given no time to read. She had refused and demanded to be brought home, and she had come home shaken and furious and had told her daughter exactly what had happened. And Camille had not believed her. That was the wound at the center of the house, and Grant felt it the way you feel a draft and can't find the window. Camille had listened to her mother describe being taken and evaluated and pressured, and she had heard, instead of a crime, a symptom. Her mother's memory had been slipping for a year, the repeated questions, the misplaced hours, the names that swam just out of reach. And so when Eleanor said someone took me and tried to make me sign something, Camille had folded it into the diagnosis. She had been gentle about it. She had been loving. She had arranged for more rest and less stress, and had quietly begun to manage her mother the way she managed everything else, and she had never once considered that a competitor might do something so brazen as to manufacture the evidence of a decline that was tragically already true. The rainy night had been the second time. The same driver, the man named Trent, who had steered the family's cars for 6 years, had told Eleanor there was a document to sign something about the trust, and had driven her out after dark to a clinic in the industrial flats, a suite of offices with a doctor's name on the door, and no patients in the chairs. They had put the papers in front of her again to be signed before the examination, rather than after. And this time Eleanor had understood, all at once and completely, what was being built around her. She had stood up. She had walked out into the parking lot, and the rain snapping the heel from her shoe on the curb, and rather than get back into that car, she had walked an hour. Maybe more, a woman of 74 in ruined cashmere, until she reached a dead bus shelter on Kessler Road and could go no farther. "They're trying to have me declared incompetent," Eleanor told him the two of them alone in a sunroom while Camille was on one of her endless calls. She said it plainly, a woman stating the terms of her own siege. There's a vote that sits with me, a deciding vote in the trust my husband and I built. As long as I'm in my right mind, I cast it, and I would sooner burn the company to the ground than hand it to the man who's doing this. So he doesn't need to buy my vote. He needs to prove I no longer own it. And it won't fall to Camille if he wins. A court decides who holds my vote once I can't. And he's paid to have them call my own daughter a conflict and hand my voice to a stranger of his choosing. Her hands were folded in her lap, very still. And the terrible part, Mr. Sullivan, the part I lie awake with, is that he isn't entirely wrong. I do lose things now. I asked you how far it was 3 times in your truck. Don't imagine I didn't hear myself. Some mornings I can't find a word I've used 10,000 times. He isn't inventing my decline, he's harvesting it. Grant thought about the number she'd shaped and failed to find, and the address she'd given without a stumble 40 years, still perfectly hers. And he understood that she was 2 things at once, and that the men in the windbreakers wanted the world to believe she was only one of them. That's why the man knew my daughter's name, he said slowly, the whole shape of it turning toward the light at last. That's why he wants to know how you sounded that night. I'm the only person who saw you between the clinic and the gate. He stopped, because saying it made it heavier. I'm a witness to whether you were still yourself. You're the only one who isn't paid to see it either way, Eleanor said, which makes you at the moment the most inconvenient man in the state. It was Camille who told him the rest of what it cost her on the second evening in a kitchen the size of his apartment, both of them unable to sleep, and unwilling to say so. I schedule her, Camille said. She was turning a glass of water she wasn't drinking. My own mother. I have a woman on my staff whose job is partly to find me 40 minutes on a Sunday so I can sit with her. I used to think that was responsible. I run a company with 11,000 people in it, and I told myself the discipline of it, the calendar of it, was how I kept everything from falling down. She turned the glass. She told me they'd taken her 3 weeks ago. She sat in my study and told me a man had driven her somewhere and frightened her. And I looked at my mother, and I thought, this is the disease. This is the paranoia they warned me about. And I rescheduled her neurologist, and I moved on to the next thing on the list. I didn't believe her, because believing her wasn't on the calendar. Grant did not tell her it was all right, because it wasn't, and she wasn't asking him to. I was under a car when my wife died, he said instead, and it surprised him hearing it come out of his own mouth in this stranger's kitchen. They called to tell me she'd taken a turn. I had 30 minutes left on a job. I told myself finishing it was the grown-up thing, the responsible thing, the thing she'd want. I clocked out clean. I drove the limit. He looked at the dark window and his own reflection in it. I got there 40 minutes after she was gone. Nobody blamed me. There was nobody to blame me. That's the part I can't put down. They sat with that. He did not comfort her, and she did not comfort him. They were, he understood, guilty of the same thing, wearing different clothes. He had been too busy to arrive. She had been too busy to listen, and both of them had told themselves the busyness was love. Outside the enormous windows, the lights of the city they'd both failed someone in went on burning indifferent, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. Grant still went to his shifts. He couldn't afford not to, and some stubborn part of him refused to let the men in the windbreakers take his work along with his sleep, and Camille had sent one of Dean's men to sit in the shop's lot while he did. It was in the parking structure 2 blocks from the shop on the third such night that the last man came for him, and this one did not wear a windbreaker. He was waiting by Grant's truck, a lean older man in a coat that had been made for him, flanked by no one, which was somehow worse than an army. He did not smile the way the follower smiled. He didn't need to. Mr. Sullivan, Victor Rennick. He offered no hand and seemed to expect none. I'll take 90 seconds of your evening, and then you'll never see me again. I find that face-to-face saves everyone a great deal of misunderstanding." Grant said nothing. The name meant nothing to him yet, and everything to him at once. "You've been given, I think, an unflattering picture of me," Rennick said. "Men following children and so on. Crude. I don't always approve of how a thing gets done in my name." He said it the way another man might apologize for a typo. "But the substance is simple. Eleanor Ashford is not the woman she was. You saw her that night, lost, half-dressed, unable to say where she was, or name her own daughter wandering the flats at 1 in the morning. That is not a competent person, Mr. Sullivan. That is a tragedy that some people out of sentiment would like to pretend isn't happening. All I require is that the truth of what you saw be written down and signed. Simply the truth of the condition she was in." "That's not what I saw," Grant said. "Isn't it?" Rennick's calm did not so much as flicker. "She asked you the same question 3 times. She couldn't produce her daughter's telephone number. She had no shoe. Any honest account includes those facts." From his coat he drew a folded sheet and held it in the cold light. "There's a figure on this. It is enough to buy the shop you'll otherwise rent until you die. It is enough to clear the hospital debt you carry around like a hair shirt. It is enough that your daughter never sits in a school with a metal detector again." He let that land with the surgical patience of a man who had bought a great many people and understood the exact weight of the things they loved. "I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to remember the parts that are convenient and to forget that you found the rest of it, the sharpness, the address, whatever gallantry she managed at the end, remarkable. Sign what's true and leave out what moved you. That's all." And Grant, who had refused Camille Ashford's check across his own threshold without a second's hesitation, stood there in the parking structure and did not answer. That was the thing he would not be able to forgive himself for later. Not that he was tempted by the money, though. He was. God help him. He saw Nora's cracked school windows, and the bill in his wallet, and the shop with his own name over the door. It was that Rennick's terms were almost true. She had asked 3 times. She had lost the number. A man could sign that and tell himself he'd only written down facts. For 3 full seconds, Grant stood in the cold and felt the whole reasonable, ruinous arithmetic of it pull at him the way finishing the job had once pulled at him, the way the sensible thing always pulled, and he understood standing there that this was the same test he had already failed once in his life, wearing new clothes. "No," he said finally. Rennick studied him without heat, refolded the sheet, and returned it to his coat. "You'll wish you'd taken it," he said, not unkindly. "Not tonight, but you will." He turned and walked away across the empty concrete, his footsteps very even, and Grant drove back to the house with his hands steady on the wheel and everything behind them shaking. And he did not tell Camille, and he did not tell Eleanor, and the not telling sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. He had said no, but he had waited too long to say it, and he knew the length of that silence, even if no one else ever would. The one good thing in the house in those days was the chess. Grant came in from a shift near dawn and found them at it in the sunroom, Eleanor and Nora, an old wooden set between them, the morning just beginning to gray the glass. Nora had refused every stranger in that house, but she had not refused the old woman, and Grant stood in the doorway unseen and watched his silent daughter lean over the board with her whole face working. "No," Eleanor was saying, and her voice held none of the fog it sometimes carried. "Don't look at the piece you want to take. Anyone can see the piece they want to take. Look at what he'll be able to do to you after you've taken it. 3 moves. Always 3 moves." She tapped the board with one ringed finger, precise as a metronome. "Where does he go? And then, where do you go? And then where does he go?" Nora moved a knight and drew it back and moved it again, and Eleanor gave a small, dry nod of approval that lit the child up like a lamp. On the table beside them was a sheet of Nora's drawing paper, and on it, in his daughter's careful hand, was the old woman. The silver hair, the straight back, the ringed fingers over the board rendered with the fierce attention Nora gave only to things she had decided to keep. She had titled it the way she titled all her drawings in wobbling capitals across the bottom. Eleanor remembers everything. Grant stood in the doorway and looked at the woman the men in the windbreakers were paid to call empty, teaching his motherless daughter to think 3 moves ahead, and he thought that whatever it cost him, he was never going to sign that man's paper. It happened on the 4th night, and it began as these things do, with a sound in the wrong place. Eleanor heard it first. She had never fully slept in that house, and she was awake in the dark of the upstairs hall, when a voice came thin and tinny from the stairwell below, one of Dean's men murmuring into a radio, and then an answer crackling back. Ordinary security chatter, the kind that had washed unnoticed around her for days. But this answer she knew. The cadence of it, the particular warmth laid over the particular flatness, went into her like a needle, and she was 74 years old and losing her nouns by the week. But this, she had not lost. It was the voice from the clinic, the man who had slid the papers across the table and told her so gently that it would all be easier if she'd just sign. Coil. He was here. He was inside the walls. She did not freeze, and she did not doubt herself. She crossed the hall to where Grant had fallen asleep in a chair outside Nora's door, and she took his shoulder in a grip like wire. "He's in the house," she said. "The man from the clinic. I know his voice. Wake up, he's already inside." And below them, in the same moment, the thing came apart. There was the heavy sound of a door that should have been locked, being opened from within a side entrance, the servant's door swung wide by a man who had a key and 6 years of trust and a name. Trent that the guard now dying at his feet had never thought to fear. Dean Holloway went down in the dark, not because he was outmatched, but because the danger had come, wearing a face he'd worked beside for years, and he'd turned toward it expecting a colleague. Camille came out of her room at the shouting, and she was not a soldier, and she had never held a weapon, but she was her mother's daughter, and in the half-second she had to understand that men were in her house, and her child guest, and her mother were at the top of the stairs. She did 2 things that mattered. She drove her elbow through the glass of the cabinet on the landing, not for anything inside it, but because Dean had told her once in a briefing she'd barely listened to, that breaking it tripped a silent line straight to the company's response team, the men who would come faster than any police, and she felt the alarm go live in the walls. And then she put herself in the only place that mattered, her body, across the door of the room where her mother stood, clutching a 9-year-old girl, her arms spread against the frame, so that the man coming up the stairs would have to go through her to reach them. He went through her. Grant, 3 strides too far away, saw the whole of it, saw Camille Ashford brace in the doorway with nothing but herself, saw the blade go into her side, saw her fold down against the frame, with one hand pressed white to the wound, and the other still somehow reaching back toward the room she'd meant to seal. And then it was Grant, a mechanic with grease still under his nails, standing at the top of a stranger's stairs in the dark, a 9-year-old and a woman of 74, behind him, a woman bleeding out on the floorboards at his feet, and somewhere below in the black house, a professional who had already gone through everyone else who'd tried to stop him. The alarm was live in the walls. Help was coming. It was 14 minutes away. 14 minutes. It was a number Grant could hold in his 2 hands. It was longer than an oil change and far shorter than the 40 minutes he had once spent driving the speed limit toward a hospital room his wife had already left, and some cold, clear part of him understood, standing at the head of those stairs, in the dark, that the whole of his life had been bending toward this arithmetic. He had been too late once. He was not going to be too late twice. This time he was already in the room. His hands went to work before the rest of him could be afraid that old, strange mercy, the steadiness that lived in his fingers while everything else in him came apart. Coil was a shape in the thin light of the hall sconces, stepping over the woman he had just put on the floor, and every instinct in Grant's body screamed at him to charge. He did not. A mechanic did not fix a stalled engine by hitting it. He went the other way, 3 strides to the service closet he had noticed his second day in the house because his eyes cataloged the place of a breaker panel, the way another man's eyes found the exits, a habit and not a plan, and he threw the master for the upper floor. The house went black. Total sudden absolute. He had understood in the half-second before he did it that the alarm had already gone into the walls when Camille broke the glass, that its cry was already out on the wires racing down the hill toward men who were already coming, and that darkness took nothing from the only thing that mattered now, which was the 14 minutes. It took nothing from him. It took everything from Coyle. In the dark, a professional was only one more blind man in a house he did not know, and Grant had a single door to hold, and 3 people whose exact place in the black he could have found with his eyes shut. He located Camille by the sound of her breathing. He got his hands under her arms and dragged her back through the doorway of the room where Eleanor stood with Nora crushed against her, and he pulled the heavy door shut on the black Hadalal and put his spine to it. "The chest," he said into the dark. "Help me move it." Eleanor was beside him before he finished the words, and together they walked a low chest of drawers across the floor by feel and drove it against the door. And Grant lifted the iron poker from the cold hearth and wedged it hard beneath the chest and down into the boards so that the force of anything coming through would run not against his arms, but into the frame and the floor, the way a chalked wheel holds a truck on a grade. It was not strength. Strength was the thing he did not have. It was leverage, and leverage he had understood his whole life. Then he knelt to Camille. He could not see the wound and did not need to. His hands had never once needed light to know a thing was broken or bleeding or coming apart at a seam. He found the tear in her side hot and steady under his palm, and he stripped his shirt over his head and folded it into a thick pad and pressed it down into her, with the flat of both hands hard enough that she groaned from somewhere far away. He needed those hands for the door. So he found Eleanor's in the dark and set them where his had been. Both hands, all your weight on it. You do not let up, not for anything, not until men in vests are standing over you telling you to. You hear me. I hear you. Eleanor's voice did not shake. Her hands came down on her daughter's wound and bore in, and under her breath, she began to count her own steadiness. The same trick Grant would think much later, that she had taught the child turned now to the keeping of her child alive. Nora had gone silent and rigid in the corner, and silence in Nora frightened him more than any scream because he knew where his daughter went when the dark took someone out of a room. He crossed to her and took her small face in his 2 hands. "I've got a job that only you can do. Count for me, out loud, to 60. And when you reach it, you start over, and you do not stop. Until I tell you to." Her breath hitched against his palms. "Can you do that for me?" 1, Nora whispered. 2, 3. That was how the 14 minutes were kept. An old woman bearing down on a wound in the pitch dark, a 9-year-old counting off the seconds one at a time, and Grant with his shoulder set against a braced door, listening to the house breathe. Coyle found them. There came the soft sounds of a man moving where he shouldn't be testing, and then the handle turned, and then a shoulder came against the wood, once feeling for the give, and the poker took the load and put it into the floor, and the door did not move. It came again, harder, a professional's measured violence, and Grant felt it travel up his spine, and he set his boots and drove his weight the other way, and the brace held, and the boards held, and Nora's small voice went on 19-20-21, and did not falter. Grant did not swing at the dark. He did not open the door. He held it. That was the whole of what he did, and it was everything a man who had learned at the highest price. There was what it meant to stay in the room, staying now, his back against the wood, refusing to be moved. The blows stopped. There came a stretch of nothing that was worse than the blows, and then, Far below the front of the house came a part with light, and shouting hard, flat voices, the thunder of many boots on stone beams of white cutting up the stairwell and bleeding under the door, and the response team that Camille's shattered glass had called came up into the dark floor in a flood. Grant heard Coyle break for the stairs, and heard him meet them there, and heard the brief, ugly work of men who did this for a living, taking hold of a man who did this for a living. Then a voice was at the door, calm and enormous, telling him it was over, telling him to open up. Down at the gate, a family car that had tried to slip out quiet in the confusion was stopped with its headlights still dark, and the man who had steered the Ashfords for 6 years was pulled out of it in handcuffs, Trent Mabry, who had opened a door. Camille lived. The blade had gone where blades are merciful, and the company's own surgeon had her stable before the night was through, and Dean Holloway, who had come nearer to dying than any of them, was dragged back from it on the entry floor by the same medics, and would spend a long season healing, and a longer one forgiving himself for the face he had trusted. Grant told her about the parking garage. He did it while she was still gray against the hospital pillows because the not-telling had sat in his chest like a swallowed stone since the night Rennick offered him a shop and a clean slate and a school without a metal detector in exchange for one signature. He found he could not carry it into whatever came next. He told her he had waited 3 seconds too long to say no. She heard him out, and when he was done, she said the thing that finally let him set it down, that a man measured by the 3 seconds he hesitated, rather than the answer he gave, would fail every test ever put in front of him, and that she, of all people, was in no position to judge a hesitation. Rennick never touched a courtroom door himself, the way he had never touched anything himself. It did not save him. Trent talked to save his own skin and named the clinic, and the money, and the man who had paid for both, and against the whole architecture of it, stood the testimony of Eleanor Ashford. Clear, exact damning the memory they had spent so much to prove was worthless, remembering every last thing that put them away. Grant took Nora Horns and one Tim Thumpiwa. The apartment was small, and the hinges still needed fixing, and the lamp burned in her room for 2 full weeks before she could sleep again without it. And he sat up with her every one of those nights and did not once wish he were anywhere else. Camille came to the shop where he worked weeks later, moving carefully, and offered to set him up in a place with his own name over the door. And Grant, who had refused her check across his own threshold on the first day of all this, refused her again. He tried to explain it, that if he took it, the 15 minutes on that road became a thing that had been bought, and he needed it to stay the other thing, the free thing, or he no longer knew who he was. She let him finish. Then she told him the one thing she had never told anyone. 2 months before the rain, believing with her whole heart that she was protecting her mother, Camille had filed a petition to be made Eleanor's legal guardian, to hold her mother's affairs and her mother's vote and her mother's life in trust for her own good. She had been building out of love the very cage Rennick was building out of greed, and she had not let herself see it until she watched a stranger refuse to sign a paper she herself had already drawn up in kinder words. She took the withdrawal from her bag and signed it there in front of Eleanor, in front of Grant. It was not money. It was the one thing money had never bought her, and she was handing it back to the woman it belonged to. "That's what I have to give you," she said. "Not a check. That." Grant took the loan. He made her write it up as a loan with a rate and a schedule, and he paid it back on time, because that was who he was. And she let him, because she had finally learned the difference between helping a man and owning him. 6 months later, there was a sign over a garage on the east side, and the letters were not straight because a 9-year-old had drawn them. Sullivan and daughter, and Grant would not have traded their crookedness for gold leaf. Every Thursday when school let out, a car came up the block too clean for the street and let out an old woman who walked in on her own 2 feet and settled in the little office at the back where a wooden chessboard sat waiting with the pieces already set. Nora would come in off the bus and drop her bag and take the chair across from her, and Eleanor would tell her not to look at the piece she wanted to take, but at what he could do to her after 3 moves, always 3 moves. And the child who used to sit in silence would lean over the board and think. Grant closed late one night that winter and drove home through the flats in the rain past the shuttered warehouses and the streetlights that failed every 3rd pole. His headlights swept a bus shelter, and under the dead overhang there was a shape, a person folded in on the cold. He was 30 yards past it before he knew. His foot came down on the brake,